In these decades, soccer was no system, no scheme, no safe space. It was noise, dust, torn-up turf, and stadiums that shook like machines at their limit. Games turned within seconds, careers exploded and burned out in the same moment. Talent wasn't a promise of salvation, but often the trigger for chaos, expectation, and pressure no one could control. Some players were so far ahead of their time that the game itself couldn't carry them. These are seven men with superhuman talent and a shadow that never left them. And we'll start now with the first name. Top 1, Garrincha. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, a single touch of the ball by Garrincha was enough to throw a stadium into disarray. For Brazil, he decided games on the biggest stage, scored in World Cups, tore apart defenses, and transformed seemingly deadlocked matches into chaotic offensive storms. His statistics don't explain why opponents stepped into thin air or why entire defensive lines froze for seconds. Garrincha broke the logic of his time because his body itself was a contradiction. Deformed, outward curved legs created changes of direction and acceleration angles that even today's tracking analyses classify as atypical. He didn't move faster than everyone else. He moved more unpredictably in curves that no defender could read. Years after the final whistle, Garrincha isn't present as a loud myth, but as a silent apparition. Black and white archive footage, museums, memorial sites. His name firmly anchored in the collective memory of world soccer. Garrincha remains proof that outstanding talent is sometimes so extreme that the game itself breaks because of it. Top 2. George Best. In the mid-1960s, George Best wasn't a winger in the classical sense, but a permanent disruptive factor for any defensive order. At Manchester United, he decided European Cup evenings, won titles with goals scored from dribbling, and forced defensive lines to shift their entire structure just because of his positioning. Numbers only partially capture his impact because Best's presence began before he even touched the ball. The break with the logic of his time lay in his control at top speed, changes of direction without loss of pace, ball control at full acceleration, and a balance that didn't collapse even on contact. Modern analyses would speak of exceptional physical stability and anticipatory spatial awareness. Best appeared where defenders arrived a step later. Today, his image doesn't live in tactical textbooks, but in iconic photographs, in exhibitions, and in the rituals of Old Trafford, where his name is carried forward as a reminder of a brief, brilliant phase of absolute freedom. George Best stands for a talent that accepted no boundaries and therefore knew no protective mechanisms. Top 3, Matthias Sindelar. In an era where soccer was characterized by robustness and direct confrontation, Matthias Sindelar played a different game. As the heart of the Austrian wonder team, he guided matches with ball touches that were barely audible, but shifted entire defensive lines. Goals and assists only scratched the surface of his influence, because Sindelar controlled the tempo without visibly speeding it up. His departure from the logic of the time lay in how he diffused pressure, early body turns, minimal ball contacts, and movements that circumvented tackles before they even formed. Retrospective analyses describe this as preemptive decision-making. Sindelar was already gone while the opponent was still reacting. Today, he doesn't exist as part of modern football operations, but as a silent figure of memory, monuments, archive images, museum spaces where his elegance has been preserved. Matthias Sindelar remains the epitome of a player who gave soccer a lightness that his era couldn't bear. Top 4, Marco van Basten. In the late 1980s, Marco van Basten was the benchmark for perfection in the penalty area. With AC Milan, he dominated Europe, won titles, set scoring records, and decided games with finishes from angles where goals shouldn't have been possible. His goals weren't accidents, but precise executions under maximum pressure. What carried Van Basten beyond the logic of his time was the combination of timing and body control. A striker who synchronized jumps, turns, and shooting angles so perfectly that even modern motion analyses describe his movements as almost flawless. He didn't need a second touch, no correction. The first impulse was spot on. But while the stadiums roared, the price began to become visible. Today, Van Basten doesn't exist on the coaching bench of big evenings, but as a revered memory, honors, archive images, quiet appearances off the pitch. His name always linked to the thought of a career that ended too soon. Marco van Basten remains the image of a striker who completely deciphered the goal and whose body couldn't sustain the code until the end. Top 5. Ronaldo Nazario. In the mid-1990s, Ronaldo Nazario changed the meaning of the word striker. Goals no longer came after long attacks, but after explosions. Two steps, a change of direction, a finish before the defense understood that the game was already decided. At PSV, Barcelona, and later Inter, he dismantled defenses with an efficiency that made numbers grow at record speed. The break with the logic of his time lay in the combination of mass and acceleration. A physique that promised power, coupled with acceleration values that even today's sprint data would mark as exceptional. His movements seemed like a software bug. Defenders chose correct running lines and still ended up in the wrong place. When the noise subsided, a different image remained. Ronaldo, whose career had to restart again and again, whose appearances today live on in documentaries, honorary stands, and quiet moments of remembrance. He appears at major tournaments as a symbol of an unfulfilled potential, not as a coach or tactician. Ronaldo Nazario is proof that even the most perfect striker's body can break from its own intensity. Top 6. Alfredo Di Stefano. In the 1950s, Alfredo Di Stefano wasn't a player of one position, but a permanent state of exception. For Real Madrid, he scored goals in finals, decided series, almost single-handedly carried titles, and defined an era in which Europe learned what total dominance meant. His numbers weren't just on the scoreboard, they were spread across the entire field. The break with the logic of his time lay in his versatility. Di Stefano appeared everywhere, finished, won back balls, directed the game from zones that formerly didn't exist. Modern analyses would describe him as the prototype of the all-action player, a player who created spaces before others even perceived them. Today, Di Stefano is not part of everyday football, but a presence of marble and memory. His name at the stadium, statues, honors, a legacy carried on through generations. Alfredo Di Stefano remains the figure who proved that total control on the field is possible, but only at a cost that hardly anybody can sustain permanently. Top 7. Diego Maradona. In the early 1980s, football reached a point where a single player could distort an entire game, and Diego Maradona was that point. At Napoli and on the world stage, he carried teams that wouldn't have existed without him, won titles against all statistical odds, and turned possession into power. His numbers tell of goals and assists, but they don't explain why entire defensive lines instinctively retreated as soon as he turned. Maradona broke the logic of his time through ball control at maximum density, lowest center of gravity, minimal contact time, explosive changes of direction that even in modern movement models are considered extremely inefficient, and at the same time unstoppable. He didn't play in spaces, he created them. Today, Maradona is omnipresent yet distant. Murals in Naples, stadiums full of candles, chants that don't fade, his image frozen in a moment of absolute control. Diego Maradona remains the embodiment of a talent that was bigger than any structure, and therefore could never be tamed. This generation didn't play against systems. They played against limits, against bodies that couldn't keep up, against times that weren't ready yet. These 7 names remind us that talent alone isn't a guarantee, but sometimes a burden. If you want to not just see, but feel such stories, stay tuned, subscribe to the channel, and go back to those eras when soccer was dangerous, raw, and uncontrollable.